The kneeling Marine. The battlefield was silent. Smoke rose from the burning wreckage of human tanks and alien war machines. Dead bodies, both human and alien, lay scattered across the blood-stained ground. The war had been brutal, and now, it seemed, it was finally over. Captain Eleanor Ellie Voss stood in the middle of the ruined battlefield. Her armor was scratched, her face smeared with dirt and blood. She had fought until her last bullet, until her last breath. But now, there was nothing left to fight with. Before her, the towering figure of High Lord Varkish of the Kaisereth Empire stood, his red eyes glowing with victory. His body was covered in dark, spiked armor, and his sharp claws gripped a massive energy blade. Behind him, his soldiers stood in perfect formation, watching their leader claim this prize. Ellie took a deep breath. Her muscles ached, her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You fought well, human," Varkish said, his deep voice echoing through the battlefield. "But your army is gone. Your weapons are broken. You have no hope left." Ellie didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow step forward. The Exizorith warriors raised their weapons, ready to strike her down if she made the wrong move. But she didn't reach for a gun. She didn't raise her fists. Instead, she fell to her knees. A murmur spread through the alien army. The great human warrior was surrendering. Varkish laughed, stepping closer. His heavy boots crushed the dirt beneath them. "Kneeling before me, Captain. Finally, a human who understands their place." Ellie bowed her head, her long, dirt-covered hair falling over her face. She didn't answer him. Varkish circled around her like a predator studying its prey. His voice was filled with amusement. "The mighty Captain Voss, I have heard of your victories, your fearless battles. And now, you kneel. You humans are weaker than you pretend to be." Ellie clenched her fists. Every part of her body screamed to fight back, to grab the knife hidden in her boot and drive it into the alien's throat. But she didn't. Not yet. Because this was part of her plan. She stayed still, letting the moment play out exactly as she wanted. She could hear the distant hum of her hidden transmission device, the one built inside her helmet. It was sending a signal, one that the aliens didn't know about. A signal to someone who was still out there. Varkish stopped in front of her. He tilted his head, curious. "You are an interesting one, Captain. Perhaps I should keep you alive. My scientists would love to study a human warrior like you." Ellie finally looked up. Her piercing blue eyes met his red ones. "Then what are you waiting for?" she said, her voice calm. "Kill me or take me prisoner. But stop talking." Varkish grinned. "You have spirit. I like that." He raised his clawed hand and gave the order. "Take her. Throw her into the gladiator pits. Let's see if she can survive there." Two massive Exizorith warriors grabbed her by the arms. Their grips were tight, their strength overwhelming. They yanked her to her feet and began dragging her away. As she was pulled toward the transport ship, Ellie allowed herself the smallest smirk. They thought she was defeated. They thought she was broken. But they had no idea. This was just the beginning. The hidden transmission. Ellie felt the cold steel of the alien shackles tighten around her wrists. The two massive Exizorith warriors dragged her across the battlefield, their heavy boots crunching over broken weapons and lifeless bodies. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burnt metal and blood lingering like a ghost. She kept her head low, her expression blank. She needed them to believe she was defeated. That was the only way this would work. Behind her, High Lord Varkish stood with his arms crossed, watching as his soldiers dragged his newest prisoner toward the waiting transport ship. His red eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Ellie knew what he was thinking. Another human, another trophy. But he was wrong. The silent message. As she was pulled forward, the smallest green light flickered inside her helmet, so faint that no one else would notice. It was the sign she had been waiting for. Her transmission had been sent. It was a simple message, bouncing between encrypted frequencies, hidden inside static signals, disguised as random battlefield noise. Captured. Proceed with Phase 2. Now, all she had to do was survive long enough for that message to reach the right hands. Inside the transport ship, the ship's doors slammed shut behind her. The metallic clang echoed through the dimly lit cargo hold. The two Exazorth guards shoved her onto the floor and locked her shackles to a metal post. One of them, a hulking brute with scarred purple skin, sneered at her. "Not so tough now, are you, human?" Ellie didn't answer. She kept her breathing steady, her pulse slow. Every movement mattered now. She was being watched. Another alien, smaller and leaner, stood near the control panel. He pressed a button on his wrist device. A holographic screen appeared, displaying lines of alien script. His eyes flickered as he scanned the data. "No trackers detected," he grunted. "She's clean." Ellie almost smiled. They had no idea. Her helmet had already done its job. The moment she had knelt on the battlefield, it had activated a tiny self-destructing microtransmitter inside itself. The signal had already left the planet. It was gone. Invisible. Undetectable. And someone, somewhere, was listening. A dangerous destination. The transport ship lurched into the sky, leaving behind the battlefield where thousands had fallen. Through a small window, Ellie saw the burning remains of human warships scattered across the landscape. It was a graveyard of steel and flesh. But she wasn't thinking about the dead. She was thinking about what came next. The gladiator pits. She had heard the rumors. A place where prisoners were forced to fight for their lives, where survival was a daily struggle, and where no human had ever escaped. That was exactly why she had to go there. Varkish believed he had won. He thought he had captured a leader of the human forces. In his mind, this was the end of the battle. But Ellie knew better. This wasn't the end of the war. This was the beginning of the rebellion. The prisoner's whisper. As the transport ship soared higher, Ellie heard a quiet voice from the shadows. "You are a fool to kneel before Varkish." Ellie turned her head. A figure sat chained against the far wall. It was an alien, but not Exazorth. His skin was deep blue, his body lean and wiry. His sharp silver eyes locked onto her with suspicion. Ellie recognized his species, a Kreshtar. The Kreshtar had once been an independent race, but the Exazorth had crushed their empire and turned them into slaves. Ellie smirked. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm smarter than you think." The alien's silver eyes narrowed. "The pits will break you, human." Ellie leaned back against the cold metal wall. "We'll see about that." The ship rattled as it entered the atmosphere of the prison planet. Ellie exhaled slowly. Now, the real mission began. Meanwhile, a distant signal receives the message. Across the vast expanse of space, light years away, deep inside a hidden asteroid base, a single red light blinked on a communication console. A human technician noticed it and immediately sat upright. "We've got an encrypted signal. It's from Captain Voss." A tall man in a black military uniform stepped forward. His face was hard, his expression unreadable. "Admiral Kane." "Play it," he ordered. The message appeared as glowing text on the screen. "Captured. Proceed with Phase 2. Kane's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Looks like she's still alive," he murmured. Then, turning to his officers, he spoke the words that would set everything in motion. "Begin the operation. We're bringing her back." The prison and the rebellion seed. Ellie had expected many things when she was captured, but nothing had prepared her for this. The gladiator pits of Durathis 9 were a nightmare. As she was dragged out of the transport ship, the first thing she felt was the heat, a thick, suffocating wave of scorching air that carried the scent of blood and sweat. The second thing she noticed was the sound, a deep, rumbling chorus of thousands of voices chanting, cheering, screaming. The Exazorth guards pulled her forward, forcing her to march down a long, rusted metal bridge. Beneath her, a massive arena stretched as far as the eye could see. Cages lined the sides, filled with creatures of all kinds, humans, aliens, and beasts she had never seen before. The ground was stained with blood. This wasn't just a prison. This was a slaughterhouse. The arrival in chains. Ellie kept her face neutral as she was thrown into a large holding cell. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy clang. She slowly got up, brushing dust off her armor. Around her, prisoners sat in the shadows, watching her with cold, unreadable expressions. A voice growled from the darkness. "Another one for the meat pit." Ellie turned to see a massive reptilian alien standing nearby. Its scales were dark green, its yellow eyes filled with exhaustion and cruelty. "Let me guess," Ellie said calmly. "They told you no one escapes." The alien chuckled darkly. "They didn't need to tell me." He held up his arm, revealing deep burn marks where shackles had once been. "I tried. Once. They made sure I never tried again." Ellie studied the cell. There were at least 20 prisoners inside, each one covered in scars, wounds, and the unmistakable look of the defeated. That had to change, because Ellie wasn't here to die. She was here to start a rebellion. The first test. Moments later, the cell door opened again. A Xi guard stepped in, holding a long electrified staff. His dark armor gleamed under the flickering lights. "You," he said, pointing at Ellie. She didn't move. The guard growled, slamming the staff against the wall, sending a crackling surge of energy through the metal. "Get up." Ellie stood slowly, staring him down. She wasn't going to be afraid. "New prisoners fight first," the guard sneered. "That is the law of the pits." Ellie didn't resist as they unlocked her shackles and led her down the dark hallway. The other prisoners watched her go, their faces expressionless. But as she passed, the reptilian alien muttered under his breath, "Dead girl walking." The arena of death. Ellie stepped onto the burning sands of the arena floor. The roar of the crowd slammed into her like a shockwave. Thousands of alien spectators filled the metal stands, chanting in their strange, guttural tongue. At the center of the arena, a massive gate creaked open. A shadow loomed. Ellie narrowed her eyes as her opponent stepped forward. It was a Grathok warbeast, a creature twice her height, its body covered in thick, armored plates. Jagged tusks jutted from its lower jaw, and in its massive claws, it held a crude but deadly spiked hammer. Ellie exhaled slowly. She had no weapons, no armor, just her fists and her brain. The warbeast let out a guttural roar, charging forward. The ground trembled beneath its heavy steps. Ellie waited. She knew that fighting it head-on was suicide. It was stronger, bigger, and armored like a tank. So she did something unexpected. She ran straight at it. The crowd falls silent. Gasps rippled through the audience as Ellie dodged left at the last second, sliding under the creature's massive swing. The spiked hammer slammed into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. Ellie sprang up behind the beast and jumped onto its back, wrapping her arm around its thick neck. The creature snarled, twisting violently to shake her off. Ellie gritted her teeth. She had seconds before it would throw her. She did the only thing she could. She jammed her fingers into its eyes. The warbeast screamed, shaking its head violently. Ellie was thrown off, hitting the ground hard. Pain exploded through her body, but she rolled quickly, just as the beast stomped where she had been seconds ago. The crowd exploded in noise. No human had ever survived more than a few seconds against a warbeast, but she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. The silent message to the prisoners. Ellie stared up at the warbeast, breathing hard. She could see the other prisoners watching from the cages above. They were watching her. And in that moment, she understood the real battle. It wasn't just about killing the warbeast. It was about showing the prisoners something they hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. She pushed herself to her feet, her voice clear despite the pain. "Is this all you've got?" she shouted at the beast. The crowd roared in approval. The war beast charged again, blind with rage. Ellie grinned. This was exactly what she wanted. Meanwhile, the rebellion awakens. High above, in the dim prison cells, the reptilian alien from before watched in silent shock. No one fought like that. No one challenged death like that. A thin, scared alien next to him whispered, "She's going to die." The reptilian alien didn't respond, because for the first time in years, he felt something he had long forgotten. A spark. Maybe, just maybe, this human was different. Maybe she was the one they had been waiting for. The arena and the betrayal. The war beast's roar echoed through the arena, shaking the very air. The crowd was on its feet, thousands of voices screaming for blood. Dust swirled around Ellie as she dodged another deadly swing of its spiked hammer. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her muscles ached. But she wasn't done yet. She couldn't be. Because this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about starting a revolution. The last move. The war beast snarled, its 3 yellow eyes burning with rage. It charged again, its massive feet thundering across the arena floor. Ellie knew she had only one chance. She sprinted toward the center of the ring, dragging her fingers through the sand as she ran. The crowd gasped. No one ran toward a charging war beast. But Ellie wasn't just running. She was leading it exactly where she wanted. At the last second, she threw the sand in its eyes. The beast screamed as dust filled its vision, its heavy body stumbling forward. Ellie dove to the side just as the beast slammed full speed into one of the arena walls. The impact was like an explosion. Metal cracked. Stone shattered. The ground trembled. For the first time, the crowd fell silent. High above, in the private viewing platform, Warlord Varkish leaned forward. His red eyes narrowed as he studied the human below. She was still alive. And worse, the prisoners were watching. The eyes of the damned. Ellie stood in the dust cloud, panting. She turned her gaze to the prison cages above the arena. Dozens of silent prisoners stared down at her. For years, they had watched gladiators die. Humans, aliens, warriors. They all fell, one by one. No one ever won. But now they saw something different. A human who didn't kneel. A human who didn't break. Ellie's message was clear, even without words. You are not alone. And the prisoners felt it. Something dangerous. Something the Xi-Zorith had worked hard to kill. Hope. The unexpected betrayal. The war beast collapsed, its body finally giving out. The arena erupted in noise, screaming, laughing, roaring. Ellie barely had time to breathe before the guards stormed in. Back in the cage, human, one of them snarled. He grabbed Ellie's arm roughly. She didn't resist. Not yet. The fight had been part of the plan. But the next phase, that was even more dangerous. As the guards dragged her back toward the prison corridors, she caught the eye of the reptilian prisoner from before. He was watching. She had his attention now. Good. She would need him soon. A whisper in the dark. Ellie was thrown back into the dark prison cell. Her body ached. Her skin was covered in dust and dried blood. But she was still breathing. And that meant she was still fighting. A voice spoke from the shadows. You fight like a fool, the reptilian prisoner muttered. But you do not fight to win. You fight to be seen. Ellie smirked despite the pain. And it worked. The reptilian stepped forward. His yellow eyes studied her closely. Who are you? She sat up slowly. Now was the moment. My name is Captain Ellie Voss, she said, her voice calm but firm. I came here on purpose. The reptilian's brow furrowed. You wanted to be captured. Ellie nodded. Because I'm here for something bigger. A silence stretched between them. Then the reptilian laughed. A cold, humorless sound. You're insane. You think you can fight the Xi-Zorith from inside their own prison. Ellie's blue eyes locked onto his. Not alone. A deadly choice. The reptilian alien, Rashek, stared at her for a long moment. Then he glanced around the cell at the other prisoners. Broken warriors, scattered souls. But they were watching now. Because for the first time in years, someone had given them a choice. To keep waiting for death, or to start fighting for life. Rashek sighed, shaking his head. You are either the bravest human I have met. His yellow eyes narrowed. Or the most foolish. Ellie smirked. Let's find out. The spy among them. As Ellie and Rashek spoke in hushed tones, another figure listened from the darkness. A thin, sharp-faced alien prisoner watched them carefully, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes flickered with unease. Then, silently, he turned away. Through the bars, the alien made a tiny hand signal, a movement barely noticeable in the dim light. A Xizorith guard in the hallway saw it and nodded. Ellie had been right about one thing. She wasn't alone. But she had also been wrong. Because the enemy wasn't just outside the prison walls. It was already inside with her. The breakout begins. The prison was alive with whispers. Ellie could feel it in the air, something shifting, something waking up. She had been in the gladiator pits of Durothis 9 for only a few days, but that was long enough. Long enough to plant the seed. Long enough to make the prisoners remember who they used to be. And now, it was time for the next move. The gathering storm. Ellie sat against the cold metal wall of her cell, her body aching from her fight with the warbeast. But she ignored the pain. Instead, she listened. In the darkness, the prisoners spoke in hushed voices. They talked about the fight, about the human who had survived. She fought like she had something to live for. No human has ever lasted that long in the pits. Maybe she's the one. Ellie let them talk. She let the idea spread like wildfire. Because hope was a dangerous thing. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. The silent recruit. Late that night, when the guards had finally left the corridors empty, a shadow moved toward her cell. It was Rashek, the reptilian warrior who had first doubted her. But now, there was a different look in his eyes. He knelt beside the bars, keeping his voice low. You meant it, didn't you? Ellie didn't look up. I don't say things I don't mean. Rashek exhaled slowly. His yellow eyes flickered toward the sleeping prisoners around them. I used to lead an army, he muttered. Before the Xizorith took my world, they put me in these pits to break me. Ellie finally met his gaze. But you're still here. Rashek's jaw tightened. For now. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ellie spoke the words that would change everything. Help me. And we won't just escape this place. We'll burn it to the ground. Rashek's eyes darkened. And then, slowly, he nodded. The plan takes shape. Over the next few days, Ellie worked in the shadows. She knew the guards were watching her more closely now. She knew the warlord himself had taken an interest. But that didn't matter, because inside the prison walls, the rebellion was growing. She spoke to the prisoners one by one, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their reasons for fighting. She found a hacker, a thin, pale-skinned alien with sharp fingers, who had once controlled entire fleets before the Xizorith captured him. She found a weapons expert, a four-armed creature with a deep hatred for their captors. She found warriors, prisoners who had been soldiers before they were broken. And most importantly, she found believers. Prisoners who still had fire in their hearts. Prisoners who were ready to fight. And one by one, she gave them a reason to believe in something again. The betrayal begins. But Ellie knew better than to trust too easily. She had been a soldier for too long. She had seen too many missions fail because of spies. So she watched. She listened. And soon, she saw the signs. The nervous glances. The sudden silences when she entered a room. And the alien who always seemed to be in the right place at the wrong time. A thin, sharp-faced prisoner. One who never spoke too much. One who was always listening. Ellie narrowed her eyes. She had her traitor. The ambush. That night, Ellie made her move. She waited until the guards changed shifts, when security was at its weakest. Then she slipped through the corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't alone. Rashek followed at her side, silent as a shadow. A few others trailed behind. The traitor was exactly where Ellie expected him to be, in a back corridor, whispering into a hidden communicator. Ellie didn't hesitate. She lunged, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. His eyes widened in shock. Ellie's voice was deadly calm. "Who are you talking to?" The traitor stammered, struggling, but Rashek pressed a blade to his throat. Ellie leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. "I already know the answer, but I want to hear you say it." The traitor's breath shook. His eyes darted between them, searching for an escape. Then, finally, he broke. "They know," he whispered. Ellie's heart stopped. "They know you're planning something." And that's when the alarms started blaring. The escape begins. Red lights flashed. Sirens howled through the prison. Ellie let go of the traitor, whirling toward Rashek. "We have to move. Now." The plan had been for one more day. They weren't ready. But they didn't have a choice. Because now, the Xizorith knew. And that meant they had one chance to get out of here alive. The final battle and the last stand. The prison was in chaos. Red warning lights flashed across the steel corridors, their eerie glow casting long, jagged shadows. Screams and alarms echoed through the walls as the sound of boots, too many boots, thundered toward them. Ellie had expected this. She just hadn't expected it so soon. Her plan had been for one more day, one more night to gather weapons, to solidify the escape route, to get the prisoners fully prepared. But the traitor had ruined everything. Now they had no choice. They either fought their way out, or they died here. The prison riot begins. Ellie spun toward Rashek as the sirens wailed around them. "We move now," she said, voice sharp, focused. The reptilian warrior nodded once, his yellow eyes burning with anticipation. "I was hoping you'd say that." Behind them, a group of prisoners gathered. Warriors, hackers, survivors. Some still looked uncertain, fearful. They had been prisoners for too long. They had been taught to obey. Ellie stepped forward, her voice like steel. "You have two choices," she said. "Stay in your cells and wait for the execution squads." She let the silence stretch. Let them feel the weight of those words. "Or pick up a weapon and fight for your life." Another silence. Then a single voice, deep, rough, filled with old anger. "I fight." Then another, and another, until finally, the prison exploded into war. The hallway massacre. The first wave of Xizorith guards stormed in, their weapons raised. Ellie moved first. She spun low, grabbing a fallen guard's shock baton, and slammed it straight into the first enemy's ribs. The electricity crackled, the alien convulsing before collapsing. Then all hell broke loose. Prisoners, dozens of them, rushed forward, overpowering the guards in sheer numbers. Weapons were ripped from dead hands. Gunfire and screams filled the corridors. Ellie fought her way through, her breath sharp, her movements precise. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was leading an army now. And they were winning. The race to the hangar. Ellie knew they had one way out. The main hangar bay, where the Xizorith kept their dropships and transport vessels. If they could get there, if they could hijack a ship, they could escape this hell. But the Xizorith weren't going to let that happen easily. As they fought through corridor after corridor, the enemy numbers grew. More guards, more firepower. And then came the real problem. The warlord himself, High Lord Varkish, enters the battlefield. The prison doors slammed open, and there he stood. High Lord Varkish. His black armor gleamed under the flashing alarms. His red eyes burned with fury. And in his massive, clawed hands, he held a sword almost as tall as Ellie herself. The fighting stopped as the prisoners turned toward him. Even Rashek tensed. Ellie clenched her fists. She had expected him to send more troops. She hadn't expected him to come himself. "You disappoint me, Captain," Varkish said, stepping forward, his voice a low growl. "I thought you'd last longer before breaking." Ellie smirked. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing about you." Varkish's lips curled. And then, without warning, he attacked. The duel. Varkish moved like a storm, faster than anything his size should have been. His sword came down in a blur, aiming to cleave Ellie in half. She barely dodged, rolling just in time, the blade slicing through the air where her head had been. She landed hard, breathing fast. This wasn't a normal fight. This was a monster. Varkish swung again. Ellie ducked, her mind racing. She couldn't beat him head-on. She had to outthink him. So she did something reckless. She turned and ran. The trap. The prisoners stared in shock as Ellie bolted down the hallway, Varkish following close behind. "What is she doing?" one of them muttered. Rashek, however, smiled. "She's leading him exactly where she wants him." The final stand at the hangar. Ellie burst into the hangar bay. The large steel doors were already partially open, the sounds of space rumbling outside. She spun to face Varkish, her heart hammering. The warlord stopped in the doorway, watching her carefully. "Nowhere left to run," he said. Ellie smiled. "I wasn't running." And then, she triggered the explosives. The explosion. A deafening boom rocked the prison. The ceiling above Varkish collapsed, raining steel and fire down upon him. The warlord roared, his body vanishing beneath the rubble. Ellie didn't stop to check if he was dead. She turned to the prisoners, to the ships. Now. They rushed forward, storming into the stolen transports. Ellie took the pilot's seat, her hands flying across the controls. As the engines roared to life, she took one last glance at the burning prison behind them. And then, with a blast of fire, they launched into space. But it wasn't over yet. As they escaped the planet's atmosphere, alarms blared inside the stolen ship. A massive fleet was waiting for them. Xizorith warships, blocking their path. Ellie gritted her teeth. They weren't free yet. Not by a long shot. The revenge and the plan was complete. The stars stretched endlessly in every direction. Ellie's hands gripped the controls of the stolen Xizorith transport, her knuckles white with tension. The ship's engines roared as it soared through the void of space, breaking free from the planet's gravity well. But just as she exhaled, just as she thought they had finally escaped, the alarms screamed. Outside, a fleet of Xizorith warships blocked their path. Dozens of sleek, black battlecruisers hovered in formation, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. They were waiting. Ellie clenched her jaw. Varkish had planned for this. The trap in space. Inside the ship, Rashek and the other freed prisoners crowded around the control panels. Their eyes flicked between the blinking warnings on the screen and the massive fleet waiting outside. "We have no weapons," one of the prisoners said. "No shield strong enough to withstand even a single hit." Ellie exhaled sharply. "They don't want to destroy us." "Not yet." Rashek narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "They could have fired the second we left orbit," she said, her mind racing. "But they didn't. That means they want us alive." Rashek frowned. "For what?" Ellie's voice was ice. "For a lesson." The call from the dead. The ship's main comms console flickered to life. A deep, growling voice filled the cabin. "Captain Voss." Ellie's breath hitched. She turned slowly toward the screen, toward the image that appeared in front of her. High Lord Varkish. His red eyes burned with fury. His armor was scared and cracked. Blood dripped from a wound across his forehead. But he was alive. Ellie had buried him under tons of rubble. She had left him for dead. And yet, here he was, rising from the ashes. "You should have finished the job," Varkish said, his voice low and deadly. Ellie stared at him, refusing to show even a flicker of fear. Funny, she said. I was thinking the same thing about you. Varkish's lips curled into a snarl. You think this is a victory? You and your little rebellion. Ellie smiled. I think you're afraid. The bridge fell silent. The prisoners behind her stiffened. Even Rashek stared. Nobody spoke to a Kai-Zoreth warlord that way. Varkish's hands curled into tight fists. I could wipe you from existence right now. Ellie shrugged. Then why haven't you? Another silence. And that's when Ellie knew she had him. The decoy maneuver. Varkish wasn't the kind of leader who let prisoners escape. He wasn't the kind of warlord who left loose ends. Which meant something was wrong. Ellie turned to Rashek and whispered, keep us moving. Just enough so they don't think we're running. Rashek gave her a slow nod, adjusting the ship's thrusters to keep a steady but controlled drift through space. Ellie focused on the screen. You need us alive, she said. You don't have control over this situation yet, and that means I have time. Varkish's jaw tightened. Time for what? Ellie's lips curled. For my fleet to arrive. The gamble. Ellie didn't know if the signal she had sent before the prison break had reached anyone. She didn't know if her people had picked up the encrypted message. She didn't know if they were coming. But Varkish didn't know either. And that was the key. Because in battle, hesitation was death. She watched his expression, saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. And she pushed. You think I did this alone? She said, stepping forward. You think I started a rebellion inside your most secure prison without backup? Varkish's fingers twitched. Ellie kept pushing. You're stalling because you're afraid of what's coming. She nodded toward the fleet outside. You're afraid your ships aren't enough. Varkish's red eyes narrowed. And then, something changed. His shoulders stiffened, his lips curled into something dark. Clever, human, he admitted. But I am not a fool. Ellie's pulse spiked. He was calling her bluff. Any second now, he would give the order. Any second now, the fleet would fire. Unless a second comm screen blinked to life, and a new voice filled the ship. The arrival of the storm. This is Admiral Kane of the Terran Defense Fleet. Ellie's chest tightened. They had come. The screen shifted, revealing a massive human battleship dropping out of hyperspace, followed by 5 more. The prisoners on the ship gasped. The Kai-Zoreth fleet hesitated. And Ellie saw it. That 1 second of hesitation. The fear creeping into Varkish's eyes. And she struck. Fire everything, she ordered. Rashek didn't hesitate. The stolen ship's thrusters roared to life, breaking into a full-speed dive straight toward the enemy fleet. At the same time, the Terran fleet opened fire. The final battle. The darkness of space erupted in light. Blazing missiles streaked across the battlefield. Kai-Zoreth ships exploded in sudden bursts of flame. Ellie yanked the controls, weaving between debris, dodging enemy fire. Varkish's voice snarled over the comms. Kill them all. But it was too late. The rebellion had begun, and the tide had turned. The last strike. Ellie spotted one last opening, a weak point in the flagship's shield grid. She turned to Rashek. Get ready to jump. His eyes widened. You're insane. Ellie grinned. Always. And then, she slammed the ship forward, full throttle. The stolen transport hurtled toward the weak point and fired everything they had. A massive explosion tore through the flagship's hull. Ellie yanked the controls, spinning them away just in time. The shockwave blasted through the battlefield, sending ships scattering in every direction. The Kai-Zoreth fleet broke, and as Ellie looked back, Varkish's flagship was burning. The end, or the beginning. Ellie leaned back in her seat, breathing hard. The battle was over. They had won. But as she stared into the void, watching the surviving Earth ships retreat into hyperspace, she knew this was just the beginning. A war was coming. And now, humanity was ready for it. Ellie smirked. "Let's go home." And with that, they jumped into hyperspace.